On behalf of the La Mesa, Texas congregation, we're pleased today to present the Maurice Brown with his study on Noah's Ark. Maurice Brown is an avid student of God's Word, having spent countless hours and time in not only developing the lesson for the material for today's lesson, but also in building the models which you'll see. Maurice Brown has spent over 50 years teaching adult classes, has done intense study and research, and has did much travel in gathering the information for today's lesson. Some of the things we're going to be looking at today is a study of the Hebrew and Greek words which are used in the biblical text. Also the purpose for which the ark was built, the technology that existed at the time, physical problems that were encountered, contemporary architecture of the, and also practical observations that can be applied to help us better understand Noah's Ark. We commend to you now Brother Maurice Brown.
Noah's Ark. The lesson today has to do with a study of Noah's Ark. And what we will be doing today is looking closely at Noah's Ark, and my explanation will be why it looks like it does. When I did my research on Noah's Ark, I laid it out on a board, and I found out that it wasn't going to look like a ship at all, but rather it was going to look more like a barge or a box. Noah built his ark at a place called Farah, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a short distance out from the Persian Gulf, where the Garden of Eden was when Adam and Eve were put in the garden. Noah built his ark at Farah about 1,000 years before the Phoenicians introduced shipbuilding. And so what we're looking at when we look at Noah's Ark, we're not looking at a ship that has a keel and planking that has to keep the water out to float, but rather we're looking at something very primitive. And in order to understand what Noah's Ark looked like, we need to go back and look at the Hebrew and Greek words that are used in the text of the Bible, Genesis 14 and 15. For a long time I struggled with the idea of what did Noah's Ark really look like. And I spent a considerable amount of time in research and experiment to decide what it really looked like, when in fact the shape of Noah's Ark is actually in the word that is used in the Hebrew text when God said, "Noah, I want you to build an ark." The word ark in the Hebrew is from a word called teba, and the meaning of teba is a chest or a coffin. And then I looked at the Greek text, and in the Greek text, the word ark that's used in Hebrew in Genesis 6:14 is kabotos. And the Greek word kabotos means a box or a chest or a wooden box. So at the very beginning, we need to rule out the idea that Noah's Ark was something like a ship, because it was not that at all. The word teba is used only twice in the Bible. The first time is Genesis 6:14. It has to do with Noah's Ark. The second time that it is used is in Exodus 2 and verse 3 to 6, when it describes the ark that Moses' mother made for him when she put him in the little ark and set him among the flags in the Nile River to preserve his life. Those are the only two places in the Bible where the word teba is used. And in both cases it means a box. In fact, when we really look at Moses' little ark that his mother made for him, we really see a miniature version of Noah's Ark. We must understand that whatever Moses' mother built for him it is a miniature of what Noah's Ark looked like. The same language is used in both cases. They were to be made to house a very precious cargo. They had to be dabbed with slime to keep out the wind and the water. And most of all, they were made to float. Noah's Ark was simply made to float. That's all it had to do, was to float. It wasn't going anywhere. In the course of a year, 365 days, it did drift northward about 500 miles. But it really, all it had to do was to float to preserve the animals and the family of Noah. And we know that since the ark was made between the rivers Euphrates and the Tigris, we know that the waters on the earth rose. They rose in the Persian Gulf. Genesis 7 and 11 says that God opened up the crevices in the bottom of the oceans and let vast amounts of water flow. And that was one of the things that helped cover the cover the earth with water. And even though the ark, all it did was float, it had no way of guiding it, it had no way of propelling it. All it had to do was to float. And if it never had have left the valley of Shinar, it still would have served its purpose. All it had to do was to float. Actually, in the distance that it floated in that 1 year, it only had to travel 1.3 miles an hour in order to make that movement from where it was made to the Mount Ararat mountain range. And so that was a point that we have to take into consideration. It only had to float. It didn't have to be narrow at the front or the back because speed wasn't a factor. It only traveled 1 mile and 3/10 per hour in 1 year. The model that we see, in fact, is in harmony with the word teba, a box or a chest, a wooden box, because what you see is the exact proportions of Noah's Ark. What we simply did was we took the dimensions given in the Bible in Genesis 6 and verses 14 and 15, and God says, "This is the fashion wherewith you shall make the ark." And he gave the dimensions. He gave it in cubits. But for our benefit, we'll reduce that to feet. And so God says you make it 450 feet long, you make it 75 feet wide, and you make it 45 feet high, and it will be in 3 tiers or 3 stories. And that's what Noah was supposed to build. As we did our study and as we looked at the word teba and how that it was a floating box, we looked at a definition given by Davison, Stibbs, and Kevin in his New Bible Dictionary. And his conclusion was that the word teba, which means a box, really meant and could have been and probably was a giant floating raft. And that makes a lot of sense. And if that's the case, then we have to look at Noah's Ark again. It's not a ship in the true sense of the word. It is something that floats, and that's what a raft is. And I know that any of us would agree that if we were faced with similar circumstances, that a raft would be the most practical type of a floating structure to build. At the time and age that Noah built his ark, 2,340 years before Christ, 1,000 years before shipbuilding and ship making came into existence. And so I assumed, after thinking about that and working with it, that is probably the right way to think about Noah's Ark, that it was in a sense a giant floating raft in which it would not be necessary to keep the water out in order to float, but that the flotation itself would be a raft. This is something that Noah could build and did build. He could lay out those long cypress logs and join them together until he got the length, and then he could build his structure above it, a cabin type to protect the animals and the family of Noah, 8 people. And so assuming that that is the case, and that's certainly the best way to think about it, people who have built models of Noah's Ark have followed that same idea that it was a raft. There is a museum of ships on the East Coast in Virginia, and it has a model of Noah's raft, Noah's Ark, and it is a raft. And it is a kind of a diorama in which we mean that it is in the process of being builded. And the first thing they did was to lay out the flotation and then build the superstructure above it. And I have a slide of that particular model of that ark. And several have built models of arks, and all have concluded that the simplest thing that Noah could have built that would serve the purpose better than anything else was a raft. And then, assuming that that is right, here are some of the problems that are naturally and automatically corrected when we think of it as a raft. We're talking about the flotation part, a raft. If it were a raft, then the water pressure on the flotation would be 0. Whereas on a ship where the water had to be kept out in order to float, the water pressure on the hull is tremendous. And the slightest leak would soon flood the ship and it would sink. But with a raft, that problem is solved. I have a book that I use, and I use it in these notes, and I've used it in my research. It is called The Flood and Noah's Ark. And on the back of this book, he lists about 12 different problems that would arise if you are trying to think in terms of building a ship that large, what kind of problems you would have. And so as we look at it, the ark that you will see, and as we will look at, the flotation part, the one is 1/3, 15 feet of it is the flotation, and it is a raft. That means that the water pressure is 0, so you don't have to keep the water out in order for it to float. If it were a raft, then it could have, and probably did have, a slatted floor on the flotation part, that first 15 feet. It would have a slatted floor. And that would solve one of the greatest problems that people worry about when we're talking about Noah's Ark. Because the slatted floor would allow the refuse from the animals to wash out through the cracks in the bottom and thus eliminate the problem of the buildup of the animal refuge that would build up in the ark over a period of a year. And so that's one problem that's automatically solved. There are many other problems that it solves. It solves problems in construction. This is something that Noah could do. He could lay out these giant cypress logs, which we believe, and we'll show in a moment that it is probably cypress. He could lay those out until he reached the 450 feet length. He could build the cross members which go to make up a raft. He could put his slatted floor on, and then he would have the ark built to a height of 15 feet. And so, before he would finish that, he would need no scaffolding at all to do that. It built flat on the ground. In doing that, he could build swimming pools, we would say, inside of this flotation, since it's just logs being laid out and made into a raft, he could build swimming pools, large pools of water that was slatted all the way around, including the bottom, and naturally the water would fill those up to the point of the slatted floor, and you would have pools of water for animals to be in when they needed to be in the water. My understanding is that hippos especially have to be in and out of the water quite a bit, or else their skin dries up and they die. There are other animals that have a need biologically to be in water a lot. All of that could be provided for in this structure if it was a raft. And we've done that in the model. We have built rafts, and then we've built the pools for the animals. Let's look at, we're talking about number 4 now, the side, about the, number 3, the wood. Pardon me. God said, make an ark of gopher wood. A lot of speculation has gone into any explanation of this. What is gopher wood? The interesting thing, I did a lot of research on this, and to my satisfaction, it turned out to be rather simple. Language scholars have not been able to connect wood with the word gopher in any known language in the world. And so they assume that the word gopher is not the kind of wood, but it is the preparation of the wood. Make it out of gopher wood. It has more to do with the preparation of the wood that Noah would follow when he built the ark. The Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, in his when they translated the Hebrew into Greek, 300 B.C. at Alexandria, when he came to the part in Genesis 6:14 where God said, "Make an ark of gopher wood," the Septuagint uses the term, "make it out of squared timbers." And we're looking at the kind, not the kind, but the preparation, squared wood. This is something that Noah could do because that was within the technology of his time. The building of a ship, it was non-existent at the time that the ark was built. But they were able to square up these logs, and they did that to make floats with and barges with, and that's what the Egyptians used as early as 1500 B.C. to float the giant stones down the Nile. And that was within their technology. Build it out of squared timbers. But there's another way in which it helps to define gopher. Some scholars believe that the word gopher is a kind of a spin-off from the word kopher, which in the Hebrew means to cover. Cover, like the Ark of the Covenant was covered with the mercy seat. It was covered. The word is kopher. It has something to do with atonement. And certainly the word atonement must be figured in somehow when we're talking about the salvation of Noah and his family from the destruction of the flood that covered the entire globe. And we're talking about a global flood when we're talking about building the ark. If the flood had only been a local flood like the Shinar Valley, then the ark would have floated south into the Persian Gulf because that is the direction of the watershed. But instead, we find that the ark actually floated north to the Mount Ararat range, not on Mount Ararat certainly, but into the Mount Ararat range. It was later called in the book of Isaiah and the prophets Armenia, the land of Armenia. But this shows a very vital point, and that is that all of the rain that fell on the earth was not all that covered the earth. In Genesis 7:11, God said that he broke up the fountains of the deep. And through those breaks in those fountains, in the bottoms of the sea, this great and huge amount of water would come from the interior of the earth and help flood the earth as the water rose. We know that the water rose in the Persian Gulf so that the ark floated north instead of south. We assume that all the other water areas rose in the rest of the ocean also. And that's what flooded the earth with water, as well as the fountains of heaven being opened as well. That pretty well covers the idea now, number 3, of the Gopher Wood. Most scholars believe that the wood was cypress, and that can be traced through the word copper, copper-colored wood, because the word gopher is connected somehow with copper in the languages as they translate it. And so we believe it was cypress wood. It is another good reason for it being assumed that it was cypress is cypress trees abounded in the Shinar Valley. Huge, huge trees. There are none there now, of course. It's very barren. But cypress is one of the best water woods that is available. Cypress was used in the West Texas area to make tanks, overhead tanks for water, because cypress doesn't rot in water. It's a very excellent water wood. And besides that, it has a good buoyancy. It floats well. It doesn't sink like some hardwoods do. And so cypress is the kind of wood that most believe it is. Now let's look at the size of Noah's Ark just a moment. Number 4, the size of Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark was a very primitive ark. It was a very primitive structure. And we can imagine that when Noah built it, when he had nothing to build it with. But as we've noticed, he could have built an ark in the form of a raft. The ark, as we said, was 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high. That's a lot larger than we imagine that it is. In the book that I use, The Flood by Alfred Raywinkle, he calculates the size of the ark by the dimensions given in Genesis 6:14. And his conclusion is that the Noah's Ark had 1.5 million cubic feet. And that's a very large structure. In his calculations, he concludes that it would take 1,000 boxcars to make that equivalent. In other words, at 1.5 million cubic feet, that's the same as 1,000 boxcars. That's the cubic capacity of Noah's Ark. In fact, it was so large that no structure that is ocean-going was any larger than Noah's Ark for 4,300 years. I'm saying, class, that from the time that Noah built his ark, that size, it was 4,300 years before anything was ever built any larger than that was on the water, ship, barge, or whatever. And the name of that ship was the Great Eastern, and it was made in 1851 A.D. Now this is how large Noah's Ark was. Now we'll notice a little later, and probably be just as well to mention it here too, that the ark being that long and that high and made out of logs put together, it could be and probably was somewhat flexible, which would make it much more suitable on the high ocean. And in order to do that, it would float much safer and much steadier if it were built that way and was a little flexible rather than being one solid, big solid box, wooden box that size. There is one thing that I noticed later as I began to add it on to the lessons that I was teaching on this. Even though that was a great, humongous size, great size, some people question that's not big enough to hold all the animals, and that's not big enough to hold all the food that was on the ark. And so when we stop to think about it, as some suggested, Noah would have probably taken into the ark very small pairs of animals. And that gives a new dimension to the size of the ark. It gives a greater carrying capacity for the size of the ark, even though it was a very large floating structure. Why would Noah take 2 full-size elephants into the ark to preserve life in that species? Animals that weighed 14 to 16,000 pounds apiece. Why would he take a pair of those full-size animals? This is the pictures you always see in our Bible classes, full-size animals in the ark. If he were to take very small animals, a pair of small elephants, a pair of small rhinos, and the others, look how much space that would save. It would take less space for the animals. It would take less care for the animals. It would take less food for the animals and less water for the animals. So we believe that that makes sense. They would be much better to reproduce after the flood, and that was the purpose for taking them into the ark in the first place, is to reproduce and replenish the earth. All right, now let's look at the door. God said in Genesis 7:16, he didn't give the size of the door, but he said, make one door in the side of the ark. Just one door in the side. When I made this model of Noah's Ark, I made the door, since there's no size given, I made the door that's large enough for the animals to enter and to get the food and equipment, whatever they wanted, I had to have inside the ark. And I hinged the door at the bottom and so it would let down and serve as a ramp for the animals to come up. And another question that was on the back of this book is, how did Noah gather all these animals from all over the world and bring them in and get them inside the ark? The Bible solves that problem. The Bible said that God caused the animals to come to Noah in pairs, and they came into the ark to Noah. He didn't have that job of going out and gathering those. They came into Noah. Somehow, some way, the Bible doesn't explain, but God communicated with the animals. And they came to Noah, to the ark, by pairs, as they went into the ark. Another thing that helps us, and we'll mention that again in just a moment, was the food. We know in Genesis 1 and verse 28 that God said to man, your food shall be the herbs of the field. You will eat the fruit and you will eat the nuts, but you're not to eat the meat. He didn't say you're not to eat the meat, but he didn't say that they could eat it. He gave them the herbs of the field and the nuts and the fruits. That was their food. But I think most of us have overlooked the next verse. In Genesis 1:29, I believe it said, and to the animals this will be your food. You will eat the herb of the field. That's what they ate. And so God said, Noah, you put in the ark food for you and for the animals. We know what kind of food Noah put in the ark. He put in the ark the herbs of the field, the nuts, the fruits, the things that could be preserved, and that's what went into the ark. In other words, class, what we can be sure of is they didn't have the problem of having to keep the animals separated. Their problem was solved. They all ate the herb of the field. They didn't have to keep the lions separated from the rabbits They didn't have to keep the lamb separated from the cougars. They ate the herb of the field, and that sufficed them. In fact, I've checked this very closely, and I haven't found anything in the Bible where that was changed until after the flood. After the flood in Genesis 9, God set forth about 4 new guidelines for both man and animal. Those new guidelines was, God said to Noah, "Inasmuch as you have always eaten the herb of the field and the fruit, you can now eat anything that you want to eat." And it also says that fear began to develop between man and beast. And fear began to develop between beast and beast. And that indicates that it was at that time that the animals began to eat each other, and it was certainly at the time that Adam and Eve could eat, and their 3 sons and their wives could also eat meat. And it said nothing about clean and unclean at that time, even though God said when you take those animals into the ark in pairs, you take so many clean and so many unclean. And so the idea of clean and unclean was certainly going to come to be a part of man's food. There would have to be a distinction made later. All right, now there was one thing about the door that I want to mention before we leave that point. The door was in the side, and it was probably a pretty large door. But notice Genesis 7 and verse 16. In that verse it said, "Noah, come into the ark." And when Noah had entered the ark and the animals, and it was ready to go, Genesis 7:16 said that God closed the door himself. We know that by that God closed it from the outside. We also have to conclude that there wasn't any way that Noah could get out once God closed the door. In fact, as we'll see in a moment, there wasn't any way he could even see out except through the light of the window, and then only up in an upward direction. God closed the door. When I teach this, I usually suggest, and I think it's important, that the fact that God closed the door indicates that it is a kind of a type of eternal judgment that we'll all have to meet. It is, in a sense, the ark is much like the church. And we often hear the expressions, "be in the ark of safety." You have to be in the ark of safety. And when I was growing up, I imagined that had to do with, in geometry, you had an ark. And it didn't quite match, but later I found out he was talking about Noah's ark. That's what we're talking about. Our old-time preacher said you have to be in the ark of safety. That's the church. And I usually think that's a good point for us to remember. But let's look at the window on Noah's ark. Most of our pictures we use in our small Bible class show a picture of Noah's ark, and they show the window in the side, and it said that God opened the door, Genesis 8:8. God opened not the door, God. In Genesis 8:8, we'll go back to that just a moment. In Genesis 8:8, Genesis said that Noah opened the door to send the dove out, the window. He opened the window to send the dove out. And the purpose for sending the dove out, the scriptures say, was for Noah to determine whether the waters were dried up off of the face of the earth. That's the reason he sent the dove out. He had previously sent a raven out, but now he sends a dove out. And he had to do that 2 or 3 times. But class, I suggest to you, and this was very important when we had to build a model of the ark to find out where the window went. If the window had been in the side, and Noah opened the window and sent the dove out, certainly he could see that the water was still on the earth, and there would be no need for sending out the dove to determine that. He could see it when he opened the window. So we know, first of all, that the window was not in the side. We would conclude that if we went back and looked at the door, because God said, put the door in the side. But when you come to the window, he didn't say, put it in the side. He said, make a window and close it within a foot, within a cubit, finish it within a cubit. We know that the window was somewhere on top of the ark. You know, we need sometimes, and I have trouble with this, we need to go back and look at the words that we're talking about. We would have never known that the word Teba in Hebrew meant a box if we hadn't have looked in the Greek, English, and Hebrew Bibles and Hebrew dictionaries that tell us what that word means. We learned that the word Teba meant a box. Well, let's go back and look at the word Toshar in the Hebrew, the window. The word window in Hebrew is Toshar, or Tohar. And it's interesting because the meaning of that word is an opening for light. Well, that could be anywhere, couldn't it? But when you study this carefully and you look at the different definitions given by the different language scholars, you begin to see, well, hey, that window's on top. And this is the reason. Delsick, in his definition of the word window, or toshar, the word toshar literally means the light of the noonday sun. The light of the noonday sun. Well, when does the light of the noonday sun come in? Well, it comes in when the sun's directly overhead, or noontime. And that's the reason that Delsick defined it that way. The window means the noonday sun. The light comes in. Well, that makes sense. Noah is shut up in the ark. He can't get out. He doesn't need to see out because he doesn't need to see all of that destruction. And the same thing is true with the judgment that's coming. He didn't need to see that, but he could look through the window if it was on top at the slots in it, and when he looked out, he couldn't see the ocean, he couldn't see the ground, but he could see the mountains around him, and that's what Genesis 8 tells us he did. In the 7th month, the ark landed in some high meadow in the mountains of Arad. And in the 7th month, he could see out through the window in an upward direction. He could see the tops of mountains around him. We know by that the ark didn't land on top of Mount Arad. That would be the worst possible place to try for God to land the ark. God was in charge of the flood. He was in charge of the ark. In Genesis 8, Moses writing it said that, and God remembered Noah and the animals that were with him in the ark. He remembered them, and we know that he took care of them. All right? In that 7th month, when the ark had settled down in some high valley in the Mount Ararat range, he could see the mountains around him. And we know by that it would be on top. The window would be on top. We'll have a picture of that a little later and show that. It was from the top that he let the dove out. He couldn't see the ground to see whether it was covered with water, but he could pull the slats back, and that's what the Hebrew words meant when it talked about him opening that window. He pulled the slats back like the Chinese do in their bird cages when they pull the slats back and let the bird out. That's what he did. He let the dove out. He let the dove out once, and it came back because it could find no resting for the sole of its feet. The second time, it brought back an olive leaf. And Noah knew by that the waters were clearing up off of the ground, and yet he had to wait a long time for it to dry up. When I was in Palestine, they told us when we looked at the olive trees that an olive tree never died. the root never dies. The top may get cut off or die, but the root never dies. It will put out again. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, those great giant olive trees are maybe sprouts from the original trees that were there when Jesus was there. But what it told Noah was that those olive trees had sprouted new leaves. And so he knew the time was nearing when he could leave the ark. Time to leave. All right. Let's look now at number 7, the food that was on the ark. We've already covered this, but I think it's important. We'll just kind of sum it up by saying that God said, Noah, you put in that ark the food that's necessary for you and your animals. That food had to be of necessity some kind of green things that they could eat. Some of it could be dried. They were in the ark 365 days and probably 7 days more. But they had to have some food, and that type of food could be kept. It's even possible, since there was water available at all times in the pools and below, it was accessible. It's not altogether impossible that plants, some kind of plants, could be growing out of that too. But the food that he put on the ark was dried fruits, nuts, anything that he could use later over this period of 1 year. The ark, they were in the ark 1 full year. It took 120 years to build it, was only in use 1 year. And so that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? All right, the last item that we'll mention here is this. We'll also, I think, mention some of the facts about it, which will help after we get through this number 8. How long did it take to build the ark? Well, in Genesis 6:3, God says, my spirit will not always strive with man. But because he is flesh, because he is carnal, he thinks fleshly, my spirit will not always strive with man. And he told Noah, I'm going to destroy man and the animals and all these things that I put on it. And so he said, since I'm going to destroy man, and because he is vain and because he is flesh, his life will be on the earth from the time he talked to Noah until he did it was 120 years. Class, I do not believe that this has anything to do with the longevity of the lifespan of man. He's simply saying, I'm going to give man a space of 120 years to repent and get right with God while Noah builds the ark. I believe that's what Genesis 6:3 is saying. I believe that's what Peter said in 1 Peter 3 and verse 21, when he said that the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, wherein the ark was in preparing, wherein few, that is, 8 souls, were saved by water. The like figure whereunto baptism doth also now save us. And I think that's an exact picture of what happened. It took Noah 120 years to build the ark, and the New Testament, I believe it's what Jude or James says, that he preached. He was a writer of preaching all of that time. He preached to the people while he was building the ark. 120 years he preached. And I've heard some preachers, and I probably have said it myself, that he was a failure. As a preacher, he was a failure. But class, that's wrong. Noah was the most successful preacher that I've ever read about. Noah saved his family. He had his 3 sons, and he had 3 daughter-in-laws and a wife. And he saved all of those. And I suggest, as we look at this, that if every family head would save his family, that would take care of your worldwide evangelism, wouldn't it? That's all we need to do, is take care of our family like Noah did, and every family on earth could be saved. That's the answer to it. That's what we need to be looking at and zeroing in on our programs. let's save the family, and we'll save the world. And we can't do it any other way. All right? It took Noah 120 years to build the ark. This is a very practical thing for me. I built the ark. I followed these instructions. I had to know what it looked like before I could build it. I'd build a lot of models, but this was a real challenge, even though it was a very primitive thing. And I worked pretty well with making things look primitive. When I do my very best, it still looks that way. But he built it in 120 years, and that's especially important for this reason. The number 40 is very important in the Bible. It's probably used as much as any other number except 7. Just think in your mind how many times the number 40 is used in the Bible. It's important. Jesus fasted 40 days in the wilderness. Elijah fled from Jezebel 40 days. The number 40 is very important. And so what Noah could have done and what we believe he did, and what is a practical thing to do, is he would build the first story in the first 40 years. In other words, he had 40 years to lay out the long cypress logs, hook them together, build the ponds, slat the floor. He could build the first 15 feet. If you divide the height of the ark, which is 45 feet, if you divide that into 3 parts, 3 stories, you have 3 sections of 15 feet high. He could build the first 15 feet, the flotation, the part that was actually going to support the upper structure. He could have built that in 40 years. That wouldn't have been a problem. And what simplified it was he wouldn't need any scaffolding. He wouldn't need anything. He could just build it, work on it, 15 feet high, complete it completely, and he'd have that much done. Then in the next 40 years, he could get up on top, put these timbers up, whatever how he did it. Several different suggestions. But the Bible says he did it. In Genesis 6 and verse 22, it said, whatsoever God said build, Noah built it. We know that Noah built the ark. God gave the dimensions. Noah built the ark. We can be sure of that. All right, then he could get up. He could build the second story in 40 years. He wouldn't need any scaffolding, no propping. Wouldn't have to prop the unit up. Didn't have any power on it, no rudder, none of that to work with. He'd get up and build the second story. It would then be ready for the third story. Then he had 40 years to get up his material up on there, work 40 more years and build the third story, and he would at that time have an ark 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high, and he would have spent exactly 120 years. And that's how God said, and that's what God said. Noah, I'll give you 120 years to build the ark. 1 Peter 3:21 said God waited patiently for Noah to do that. God works on a time schedule. We know that's true. With God, time means nothing. In eternity, there is no such as time. Time has no beginning or no ending. But when God created the earth and set the time motion, the planets, and the moon and the stars, in fact, he built a giant clock, and he instituted time. And man lives solely by time, and God, from that time on, works with man with time. Doesn't it say in Galatians 4:4, when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son into the world. They asked Jesus in Matthew 24, when is the end of time? Jesus said, no one knows. The angels do not know. Even the Son does not know. Only God knows. And then the time will end. In Revelation 6, there was a vision given to John, and an angel stood up Revelation 9, where the angel stood up and said, time shall be no more. And it will end. And then eternity will continue. All right? Now I want to make two statements. This model that we built had to be floated before we knew for sure whether it was a good model. I did all this work on it. It really took me about a year to build the first one. And I put it in a place, and I turned the water hose on and let the water in, and I just sat there and watched it. I wanted to know whether it's going to float or not. And to be a proper structure, it should float at the water level of the slatted floor. That's where the water should stop. So I watched it, and then when the pool filled up, the little ark just started floating off on the water. And that reminded me of Genesis 8. It said, and the water, the flood, and the ark went on the face of the waters. And it's a very beautiful little structure when you put it in the water. It floats. This model floats. And it's a very beautiful little model. It floats. All right? I want to give these facts very quickly about this model. First of all, the model is the same proportions as Noah's Ark. The scale of this model is 1/4 of an inch equal 1 cubit. 1 cubit being the ancient Hebrew or Babylonian measurement of the forearm from the elbow to the tips of the fingers. Of course, on some people that would be longer than others, but basically that will just about figure out about 18 inches. So the scale of this model is 1/4 of an inch, as we know it, to 1 cubit in the Bible, which is about 18 inches, being the Babylonian cubit, which I believe we should use rather than the Egyptian cubit, which is 22 inches. Because after all, the ark was made in Babylon, which was later called Babylon, in Mesopotamia, between the rivers. That's where it was made. All right? This model is made out of oil-treated cypress, which language scholars believe to be the Gopher Wood of the Bible. This model has 132 rooms. God said, rooms shall I make in the ark. I later learned that he wasn't telling him to get in there and make a bunch of stalls, but this had to do with the structure of the ark, the physical structure of it. Whenever you build something like this, post and lintel, in architecture, you have to have vertical supports and horizontal supports. And in this particular scale, it turned out to be 15 feet each way, and this model is 2 inches each way. And whenever you make it that way, the resulting horizontal and longitudinal and vertical supports will divide the ark into 132 rooms, and I believe that's what Noah's Ark had. And that's the reason it had that many and no other. And it has 2 pools built in it for the hippos and for alligators and other things that need water on their skin. This particular model has no nails, no metal of any kind. I think we're looking at a time prior to those ages when metal became into use. We're looking at a time 1,000 years before shipbuilding was even attempted. So I don't use any kind of metal. Wooden pegs and some kind of glue and the coating on top of it. 132 rooms, 2 pools in the flotation, put together with wooden pegs. On this particular model, we've added something that the Bible doesn't call for, but certainly something that Noah could have done to make it more functional for the use for which he was to use it. In a sense, I more or less got the idea from an Italian model maker, and he had a water system on it with a trough on the top. You know, it rained 40 days and 40 nights, but that was just the big rain. The Bible says in Genesis it continued to rain for 150 days. That's when he cut off the rain. He stopped the rain at the end of 150 days. he closed the fountains of the deep at 150 days. And so they had rain. The object was not to keep the water out of the ark, but to get it into the ark with this type of flotation, so that it could be used with those animals and people to keep the ark cool, and that would be accomplished by this. A collecting system that collected water. When the pools on top would be full, they would overflow into the second lower level. When they filled up, they'd overflow onto the slatted floor and would go on out into the ocean below. The door is hinged in order to serve as a ramp. It has 142 animals in it. It has 8 people in it, and enough food for all of those to last 1 year. And that pretty well covers the lesson on Noah's Ark.